First of all, before we get started, Brian, I'd like to thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedule to talk with me and our audience today.
Well, Ralph, thanks so much. It's an honor to be here, and I appreciate being here with you, and especially with all the value that you've provided to the stroke community yourself. It's an honor to be a part of this. So thanks for having me.
Well, thank you. I wanted to start with what was your first musical recollection in life? How old were you?
Yeah, you know what's interesting, Ralph, is that I come from actually not a musical family, which may surprise many people. So there actually wasn't a lot of music in the house. There wasn't a lot of music listening really happening throughout my family or music playing. So really my first recollection of any sort of music happened through school. And I can remember being a part of both sort of choirs in school, learning how to play instruments early on, and also through my church, where I was heavily involved with the children's choir and these types of things. But my first real recollection was, I think, both through a schooling perspective and through my community church.
And when did music start playing a more important or a defining role in your life? At what point in time was that?
Well, actually, that was pretty young when I started learning how to play instruments more seriously. So my first instrument was learning how to play the viola, which I started at about 8 years old, learning how to play. And I really fell in love with performance, and I fell in love with the connection that I could have with music. And then as I went on, a couple of years later, when I was about 10 years old, I learned how to play the drums. And I think the combination of those two vastly different instruments, both in style and types of music that were played, and even the way that they're performed was so vastly different. I really fell in love with also the spectrum of music. And I knew pretty early on in my life that music was going to be an important part of my life and my career, but I didn't know exactly what that meant.
Well, perfect, because that leads into my next question, which was, when did you become aware that music could be used as a therapy?
Yeah, that moment for me happened in high school, actually. So this was as I was thinking about college and what life after high school would look like. As I mentioned, I knew that music would be a part and a meaningful part of my career. But I knew that music education was not for me. And I also knew that the music performance route, while exciting, perhaps was not the avenue for me either to pursue professionally. But I heard in high school, actually, from a school guidance counselor about this idea of music therapy, which just on the surface, I loved the idea of, meaning that you could use music as therapy to help people. And that's what really sparked my interest in wanting to learn more about this field that I had never heard of prior to that.
Okay. Well, I was going to ask you to go into a little bit more about that transition. So at some point, so you went off to college and you kind of like feeling around with how music could play a more important role in your life. As I understand from reading about you, when you graduated from college, or sometime right before that, you started thinking about a career in music therapy and even maybe neurological music therapy. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so when I was in college, I started majoring in psychology and I minored in music, thinking about putting together these two subjects, the intersection of science and music, to help people. At the University of Maine is where I did my undergraduate degree. I had the opportunity to take an online course in music therapy. It was the only class on music therapy that the University of Maine had at the time. And I immediately fell in love with the content. The more that I understood about this field, about some of the clinical evidence behind it and seeing the outcomes, I really found that this was something that was very compelling for me. That course was taught by a man by the name of Alan Wittenberg, who at the time was the only private practicing music therapist in the state of Maine. And that summer, after taking the course, I had the great pleasure and the opportunity to intern with Alan for a summer. And he was working with children and adults with severe developmental delays. So he was working with children that my very first patient that I ever witnessed music therapy live with was an 18-year-old boy who was physically and cognitively functioning at about a 1-year-old level. So very, very low functioning. He was in a wheelchair, not really able to interact with his environment. And in that very first session, within about 10 minutes of the music therapist working with him with live music, this boy began functioning at a higher level than what anybody in his life had ever seen before, in terms of his ability to interact with the environment, his eyes opening, looking around, to the point where the people who worked with him literally every day, his family and the people that worked at the group home that he was a part of, were literally in the room in tears because they couldn't believe how this boy was functioning. And it was at that moment that I realized that that this was my calling in life, that I needed to be using music in this way to help people. But that two, while this was a magical thing to witness, it was really a beautiful moment to be able to witness, I knew that there must be a reason why his brain allowed him to respond this way to music in that moment. And if we could really answer that question of why is this possible, then that's when we could really harness the power of music and then replicate it to help a lot of people. It was also at that point that I really was driven by that need to want to figure out how do we bring this to more people. When you hear about music therapy, I think for a lot of people it makes sense. But when you see it with your own eyes, it's a whole different experience in relationship to the work. And so really trying to understand how can we bring this to people in a meaningful way, and that was really the start of my career.
Well, that's interesting that you had that defining moment, because my next question was going to be about when you got interested in neuroscience, and obviously it was at that point that you had that realization that this was something that was fantastic, that was happening in front of you, and there was science behind it. Therefore, if you could get to the reason, then it could possibly be repeatable. So can you talk a little bit about how that transitioned in your life to, as I understand it, you also studied neuroscience in addition to music therapy, so that there's a connection here between your understanding of how the brain works and how music therapy works.
Yeah, and I think even as we come back to thinking about music therapy and answering that question of why, I've always been intrigued by neuroscience, by science, and by objective data. And it was really sort of this fundamental belief that understanding how music was impacting outcomes, so how music could impact this boy's brain, but also how it could actually change his function in a quantifiable and objective way, to me was the answer to figuring out how we replicate it. So we can't standardize and we can't replicate it unless we really fundamentally know how it works. And so I, from that point, went to Lesley University to get my master's degree in music therapy. And then I began really studying neuroscience. What I found actually was that when you looked at the field of what's called neurologic music therapy, which is a small specialization within the field of music therapy at large, that focuses purely on the neuroscience of music, the evidence that exists about how humans perceive and produce music, but then also how it can be clinically applied to help people recover function that has been lost due to some sort of neurologic disease and injury. What I found even at that time was that there was a very solid foundation of research that already existed about how this was possible and some of the interventions that could be used to improve patients' functioning. Since that point, the amount of research has grown exponentially in the field, both through academic and educational research and healthcare research as well. But really, in the early days, there was a strong foundation that made me say, there's something here and we really need to pursue this greatly.
Not everybody, I understand, but not everybody understands the effect of music on the brain. Would you mind spending a minute or so talking about how music opens up pathways in the brain?
Yeah, I would love to, Ralph. This is a great topic, one of my favorite topics to talk about, in fact. And so when we think about the human brain just in general, there are parts of your brain that control each aspect of our bodies, and the way that we think, and the way that we move, and the way that we speak, and the way that we talk. It's a very complex network of systems in our brain that control everything about our body. And what the research has shown is that when we as humans listen to music that we like, it engages the parts of our brain that are responsible for movement, language, attention, memory, emotion, executive functions. So really this global engagement. And when we think about engagement, what I actually mean is an activation. So if you were able to essentially look at a heat map of your brain, these different parts of your brain would be activated while you're passively listening to music. And there's no other stimulus on earth that engages our brain like music does in this way. They've also shown that engaging in music, so engaging in music being learning how to play an instrument, it could be singing in a choir, could be singing casually in your bedroom. Or now we're understanding engaging in music could be engaging in the interventions that we do as clinicians, that aids in the process of neuroplasticity. So neuroplasticity is our brain's ability to create new connections or strengthen old connections throughout our entire life. Neuroplasticity is the fundamental reason why we can learn new things as we age, but it's also why people who have injuries to the brain, like stroke or traumatic brain injuries, can recover, because our brain can create those new connections. And it's been shown that music is able to aid in that process of creating those new connections, or essentially helping the brain to heal. So when we think about how music globally engages our brain, and that it helps to aid in neuroplasticity, or the brain's healing process, that's why it's such a powerful healthcare stimulus. And everything that I mentioned about neuroplasticity and neuroscience, specifically about the neuroscience of music, is applicable to 97% of the human population. So regardless of age, culture, ability, disability, history with music, preference of music, regardless of any of that, everybody's brain objectively responds the same to music. And that's why it's so powerful.
Cool. Makes me wonder what about the other 3%, but we'll save that for another time. So obviously at some point you graduated, and as I understand it, you went directly to Spaulding. Is that correct?
Yeah, so upon graduating from graduate school with my master's degree in music therapy, I was hired as the first clinician or the first music therapist at Spaulding Rehabilitation Hospital in Boston. And Spaulding is a world-class organization. They're the Harvard Medical School affiliate for neurorehabs, and they're consecutively ranked as one of the top rehabilitation hospitals in the U.S. And I had the great honor of building their first music therapy program, which was focused primarily on their stroke and brain injury units, where I was treating patients with these live music interventions based upon neuroscience, helping people improve walking and improve language and improve cognition across functioning levels and different areas.
That must have been exciting for you as a new graduate, and it kind of explains, I was going to ask something about how you ended up focusing on stroke and TBI, but it sounds like that occurred due to the work you were doing at Spaulding.
Yeah, it was really an incredible experience. It's such an honor for me to be able to build this program at such a prestigious institution, but with a world-class team as well. I mean, the clinicians and the doctors and the administrators at Spaulding were so supportive of this new work, not to mention the incredible results that we were seeing with patients. We were seeing that patients were getting better faster with greater results. And then we now had the neuroscience to not only explain how this was possible, but also how we could standardize and replicate these interventions to help many different patients. And so it was really an exciting time to be building this out within the organization, but such an honor to do so as well.
So I would imagine that a lot of what you do in rehabilitation is work on walking again, on gait. So I imagine at some point, probably it sounds like fairly early on, since you were aware of what could happen with music therapy, having had the experience with that young person in the wheelchair and possibly others. Talk a little bit about your first realizations about what music therapy could do for your gait patients. I, of course, have watched some of the early videos, so I'm seeing you walking backwards in the halls at Spaulding, strumming your guitar, having this aha moment, but I want to hear it from you.
Yeah, it's an amazing thing to think about when I think back on those moments, because when you talk about an aha moment, the incredible thing about this work was those aha moments happened every single day. We were treating patients and seeing these what seemed like miraculous responses to the interventions. But then, as I mentioned before, we could continue to replicate them. And one of the videos that we have on our website is from a man by the name of George, who had a pretty severe cerebellar stroke. And he had a very severe asymmetry when I met him. So his right side was his affected side. And we talk about asymmetry in the sense that his right side was not taking the same size steps as his left side. And he had been walking with a cane for weeks in the hospital and walking very slowly. And as we started to do this intervention called rhythmic auditory stimulation, which fast forward a few years became the basis for what MedRhythms is doing now, but we started doing rhythmic auditory stimulation with him. And this is an intervention that has been studied in research in the lab setting for about 3 decades, since the mid-1990s, demonstrating how it can improve things like speed and cadence and asymmetry. So as I was working with George, we started this process. And what we began to notice was that he was having an immediate response in the moment to this intervention. So just with, as he started to walk with the music, his symmetry improved, his size of his steps improved, his balance improved, into the sense that within one session, we actually were able to remove the cane that he had been using for weeks. And he began to walk for the first time after his stroke without a cane. Over the course of his session, we significantly improved the size of his steps, his balance, his symmetry, and his cadence. To the point that at the end of the session, when we took the music away, we saw what we call carryover. So he actually was able to walk without the music present. Because that's really what we're trying to do as clinicians. We're trying to use the music to change the non-musical function, being the walking. So that when we take the music away, people can walk and we can see a change in their function. And it was really with George that planted the seed that there was something very compelling, very real, very quantifiable here that we felt the world needed. You know, as I was seeing these outcomes with George and other patients, it kept coming back to me now that we could. So question number 1 in my life, in my career, was answering, how is this possible? Because then if we could answer that question, then we could replicate it and reach a lot of people. Now we had answered that question. Why is this possible? How is this possible? But then the answer came to me, well, why doesn't every single person on earth have access to this important care when they've had a neurologic disease or injury, when we can see results like this that are quantifiable and replicable? And that's really what started the mission of MedRhythms, was answering that question.
And as I understand it, you had great success with the patients, and therefore the program at Spaulding had great success, and there started to be additional demands from lots of people saying, hey, this works, I want to give it a try. Can you talk a little bit about how that occurred, that build up to where you started to realize that it needed to be bigger than what you were doing there? And what I'm trying to get at is how, how MedRhythms ended up evolving out of that whole experience.
When I was treating patients there at the hospital, as you can imagine, this was a very new field. Nobody had ever really seen neurologic music therapy in action before. And as we were seeing these really incredible results, as I mentioned, these were not sort of one-off results here or there. We were seeing lots of patients see these just incredible results throughout our time at the hospital. So very quickly after starting that program, the demand for my services, both from physicians who were writing orders for me to see their patients within the hospital, but also from patients and their family members who were coming to me and saying, Brian, you helped my dad walk again. How do I get more of this when I leave the hospital? And at the time, the answer really was, there's nothing you can do. And that was an awful conversation for me to have with patients and their family members on a regular basis. To literally say, you've had this incredible response here. There is something that can help you, but there's nothing that I can do. And there's no options for you once you go home. And so it was really at that moment that we were thinking about MedRhythms and thinking about building MedRhythms as a way of figuring out how do we bring this important care to people that we believe not only need it, but deserve to have access to it. And that was really the driving factor here, and a fundamental belief that if there is something out there in the world that can be helpful for patients, that patients deserve to have access to it. I never dreamed of being an entrepreneur, particularly in a tech field or in a healthcare field. But when we were seeing such a high need and a high demand, and we found that we had the solution to that need, something that could help with this burden, I felt like we had a responsibility to do something about it. And that was really the driving force for saying, this is bigger than Spaulding. This is really bigger than Boston. This is bigger than the US. This is really a global need, and we can and will do something about it.
One thing I noticed, Brian, was that I did participate in one of your trials with the sensors and the phone, for lack of the medical device. And what I found was that it helped me relax in a way. It kept me from overthinking my walking. I'm a stroke survivor myself, as you know, and one of the things that a stroke does to you is you end up thinking about everything you did because the brain doesn't have a map for what it does. It does it automatically. So you wake up in a hospital bed and you say, how did I used to move this arm or this leg? And you have no memory of that. And so you try and look at your other side and everything and figure it out, which means that, for 13 and a half years, I've thought about every single step I've taken. You just can't get rid of it. And I found that the whole thing with walking with the music relaxed me and got me to stop overthinking so much. And I think part of the whole thing with stroke recovery, for me, at least in my experience, was, well, my therapist said to me on day one, Ralph, we're trying to learn how to forget how to walk, meaning not think about walking and have it become natural. And the few times that I've actually had natural walking occurred like when I wasn't thinking about it. I'm looking at my backyard because half a dozen of them occurred right out there. I'd be walking back from my office and I'd go, oh wow, you're walking perfectly. And then of course I would start thinking about it again and I would go into all of the bad habits. So the whole thing with the music, it also helped me with, I could hear the metronome in my head after the music stopped. I really got into the entrainment's the word you guys use, the patterning. So I think that had a real effect. So I just thought I'd share that with you while Eric was.
Well, Ralph, we are back in action now. But there's actually a neuroscience explanation for that. too, and it's great to hear your perspective of what that felt like. Because the two things that you said were that it felt more automatic and that it helped you relax. And what's the really interesting thing about that is, from a neuroscience perspective, what we are trying to elicit with our digital therapeutics, with this intervention, is using music, specifically the rhythm in music, to activate your motor system at a subconscious level. So without going too deep into the neuroscience, that's what the research actually shows, is that when we have an external rhythmic cue, that it activates your auditory system, because it's an auditory cue, so you hear it, so your auditory system is activated. But your auditory system and your motor system are subconsciously connected, which means that your auditory system and your motor system begin to fire in synchrony with that external rhythmic cue, and that's what we call entrainment, as you mentioned. So the auditory system and the motor system are in training with each other and with that external cue. Because it's a subconscious connection, how that portrays itself in clinical work or in clinical intervention is that patients don't have to think about walking, because the music is driving the automaticity back to the movement. So the rhythm is actually telling your motor system to fire, to move, such that you don't have to think about telling your body to do it. The music is telling your body to do it. So there actually is fundamentally a neurologic reason why you feel that way. And then also, we can remember that while we don't focus a lot about the music when we explain the neuroscience of it, focused on things like emotions and relaxation with music, because we're really focused on the neuroscience and improving movement. But we can't take away the fact that music is inherently an emotional stimuli, right? So we hope that by being able to use familiar music, that it will be engaging, it will be fun, but that there is also a level of relaxation that happens, or comfort that happens in doing the intervention, because we're creating a situation that hopefully is enjoyable as well.
Interesting you talk about conscious, subconscious, because I've experienced it on two different levels, subconscious level and the conscious level. Being very interested in this subject and your product, I, of course, while I was walking, was thinking about what was going on a conscious level. But on a subconscious level, I found that my brain very much wanted to always hit the metronome, which would sync with the downbeat, with my affected foot. And I even consciously tried to hit it with my other foot, with my strong leg. I didn't like it so much. Sometimes in order to get back in sync, I'd have to do that. But there was something subconscious going on where my brain just wanted to put my left affected leg down on the downbeat. And it's like, it was very automatic. And I'm here thinking about something that's happening subconsciously on a conscious level, and I was aware of it. So it was very interesting.
That's a very sort of meta thought, right, Ralph? There's something happening subconsciously, but you're aware that this is happening. And we actually get that feedback a lot from our patients who are using the product. When they do the intervention, they give this experience that the music is pulling them, or that it's driving them, or it's making their affected side move differently in a way that they haven't in a while. But that they're aware that this is happening, but they're also aware that they aren't really having control over it. And I think that the awareness comes because fundamentally you're aware that something different is happening than the way that you've been walking for however long it's been since your injury, particularly with our first product that we're focused on chronic stroke. I mean, we're seeing some of our patients that have had walking deficits for, 6 months, 6 years. Some of our patients are 10, 20 years post-stroke. So they're they're conditioned to walk in a certain way, that now that they're getting a new stimulus to their brain, or a new stimulation, something's changing, right? And it's a subconscious cue, but we're very aware because we're moving differently. It's really a profound, I think, experience for some of these patients.
Well, and I'm 13 and a half years out now. It was a couple months ago, so I was still more than 13 years out, and I found it had an effect on me. Of course, I'm a big believer in neuroplasticity, and I'm always interested in things that maximize neuroplasticity, and it seemed to me from my experience that that was what was going on with me when I used the product. But I want to kind of jump back into Spaulding and talk a little bit about the transition to MedRhythms, because you're still working at Spaulding, but you realize there's this greater need, and you're coming to another one of those decision points in your life about, well, how can we fix this, and what does it mean for my future and the future of music therapy? So if you could talk a little bit about what was going on then and how you figured out what to do about it, that would be great.
That's quite a loaded question, Ralph. What was going on in the inner psychology of Brian and making these decisions about what to do with the future of the company? But for me, the first logical decision that we made was just trying to figure out how do we help more people, which meant more hours in a day treating patients. That was step one. And really the early days of this was I would work 40 hours a week treating patients in the hospital, and then every evening and on weekends I would go to patients' homes to treat them in their homes as a way of continuing that level of care. From there, as the demand continued to grow, we actually started MedRhythms as a therapy practice. So we were treating patients outside of Spaulding, where we hired a team of clinicians to treat patients in their homes, in other facilities as well. But there really became a moment as we were looking at this that, as we thought about scaling, right, that scaling a services business is a very long process because of how you're scaling individual people, and it's an expensive process, particularly in an area where there wasn't clear reimbursement for the services. And in addition to that, we found very early on that it was really difficult for us even to find enough trained clinicians in neurologic music therapy for the need that we had just in Boston. And so we realized quickly that scaling a services practice was not going to work to really meet the vision that we had of what this could be and the impact that we believed that we could make and should make. I will say from my own personal journey into this, I am a clinician by heart, and I love treating patients. I love connecting with patients. I love the challenge of turning the science into clinical application. I love the connection that we have with our patients to watch them in their journey of recovery. I love supporting patients in that way. And as I was thinking about sort of removing myself a bit from the clinical work, there always are those challenging decisions to be made, right? So should I step away from clinical practice? I certainly can't operate a company while I'm treating patients 40 hours a week. But for me, my driving force, if we come back to this, was always about impact and how do we bring this to people who we believe need and deserve it. And I had to make a fundamental decision in my own life to say that I felt like I could make a bigger impact in the world if I wasn't treating patients 40 hours a week. That perhaps by me stepping away from clinical work, that 40 hours could become hundreds and thousands of hours of patients being treated if it wasn't me doing it myself. And there isn't a way to scale one person. And while I would love to replicate myself thousands of times and do it all, that's not possible. And so there certainly was that tension point at the beginning of thinking about how do we take even my own connection to the work and what decisions need to be made to help the company scale.
And how did you do that, and how is what you're doing groundbreaking?
It's interesting because as I think about that transition from going from a full-time clinician to call it a full-time CEO or a full-time entrepreneur, there's a lot of important data points along that journey that showed that A, there was something here, and that B, we were doing it the right way. And at early days, it was really, we knew that we had something because we were seeing the patients recover. As we started to build the therapy practice was growing. There was a high demand. Patients were coming, reaching out to us who had found us online. We had other clinicians who were referring patients to us. And so we knew that we had something and that the clinical work was working. Where we kept getting stuck, right? And I think this is the entrepreneur's journey, right? And the seed of entrepreneurism is where we're getting stuck was figuring out how we do more. We kept reaching a breaking point where we couldn't find enough clinicians or we couldn't scale fast enough for the patients that we had. So the answer to reaching more patients was technology, right? And as I thought about that journey as a clinician, there certainly was some hesitation at the beginning to say, wait, technology to replicate what we're doing as clinicians? And I actually had a moment at Spaulding where it was actually, at the time, was the chief information officer at Spaulding who came to me and asked me about treating a patient that he was connected to in their home in New York. Well, obviously I didn't live in New York. So I said, well, obviously I can't go there. And he said, well, what about using technology to treat patients? At that time in the journey, my reaction was, well, technology will not be as good as I am as a clinician with my clinical thinking mind. And his immediate reaction to that statement was, well, wouldn't 70% of you be better than 0? And I had this sort of epiphany in that moment of we need to do something to be able to scale. And even if at the time I thought perhaps this wouldn't be as good as a clinician, let's try this out. So I made a commitment to myself to open my mind to what new things could happen. Whether this is technology, what could this be? What I quickly realized as we started this journey of building technology to replicate rhythmic auditory stimulation, that actually the technology was good enough to be as good as a clinician would be. And I'll tell you the moment that I knew that. When we were in the office here, building this technology to replicate rhythmic auditory stimulation, we went through a process where I spent hundreds of hours with stroke survivors training the software or training the algorithms to think like I would. So when you see a patient do X, do Y with the music. When you see a patient do Z, do A with the music. And this very complex actual algorithm of trying to replicate what my brain would think in real time. The very first time that we ever and I would actually make these changes live on the spot with the technology. So I would walk with a stroke survivor, I would change the music, our engineers would time sync when I made those changes, and then would actually code that into the algorithm. So there was the very first time that I watched a 30-minute session with our product where I was completely hands-off, and the product did exactly what I would have done as a clinician. And it was at that moment that when we talk about, hey, can this be as good as a clinician? I was trying to get 70% as good as a clinician, and I realized that this actually could be as good as I could do clinically. But then, the more important piece, fast forward about a week, as we continue to train the algorithm, we're getting very high fidelity clinical data about how people are walking in real time. And that's what's actually informing the decisions that are made in the algorithm. I was watching our product, watching the decisions that it was making, while I was watching a stroke survivor. As I noticed the stroke survivor walking, I noticed that the change happened in our algorithm. It told me that somebody was walking too asymmetrically. And I said, well, that's interesting because I don't see that. About 5 seconds later, I saw that. And what I figured out in that moment was that the technology could actually detect these clinical changes before I could even see them as a clinician. And it was at that point that I realized that the technology not only can be as good as, but in some cases can be better than a clinician, at treating patients because of how good the technology is to collect that data. And that's when I knew that we had a groundbreaking technology.
I understand you go back to the clinic regularly, and why is that important, and what do you learn there, and why is that learning important to what you're doing as you move forward?
Getting back into the clinic is important for me on many different levels. On a deeply personal level, it's really important for me to stay connected to the clinical work. It's what I love. So it feeds me as a human being and as a professional to be treating patients. It's also important for me in leading this organization that I stay connected to the ground level, both in the clinical application, that I know what's coming down the line in terms of research, in terms of next generation clinical application, but also that we stay rooted in the why of why we exist. It can become very easy as you remove yourself from that scenario and you start building technology and building an organization and hiring a team, thinking about the FDA, thinking about reimbursement, thinking about clinical trials, to actually lose fundamentally why we exist as an organization. And I've made a commitment to myself to never let that be the case. And so it's important for me to stay rooted in the clinical work to make sure that we are grounded in our mission. It's also really important, not just for me, but we have every new employee, intern, contractor that we work with at MedRhythms also spends a day in the hospital at the beginning of their time at MedRhythms, shadowing our clinicians so that they can see both the need, the outcomes, what the potential is, why the technology is important, and hear from the patients themselves about the potential this has to change their lives. Unfortunately, with COVID, we've been limited in our ability to do that. But I think it's a critically important aspect of building the organization and who we are, that we stay really grounded in that, on the boots on the ground level of what we're doing.
Okay, this is about the fourth time that I've wanted to ask this, so I'm going to break down and ask it. Somebody gave you your big heart. I'm curious who that was and what those influences were, because it's obvious that you're interested in more in people in the clinical side as much as or more than developing artificial intelligence and algorithms. That is that's being driven by that big heart.
That's an interesting question, Ralph. And I will say that I 100% agree that my drive here is not about making sure an industry grows. It's making sure that more people get access to the care that they need and that they deserve. The growth of the industry is the conduit, or we'll call it the vehicle, by which more patients get access to care. And I will say that fundamentally at the beginning of this, our co-founder Owen McCarthy and I have always believed in businesses that do good in the world, but we've also believed that business is a factor by which you can have grand success and impact at scale globally. When we think about large global impact and the vision that we had, we've always fundamentally believed that business can be the way to accomplish that. So as I think about back, in my own life, I mean, I've always had great examples of people who cared and who were committed. I mean, particularly as we even look back to my childhood, and I'll use my parents as a great example of that. If there was ever an example of two people that were committed to things outside of themselves, it was certainly my parents. And so I think from a very early age, I learned what sort of dedication, what selflessness looked like. And then from there, I think that I was always driven by wanting to be somebody that could be a helper. And I don't know whether that came from parents teaching, whether that came from, if you believe in a higher power, of what was, a God-given sort of, I don't want to call it a skill, but a trait, a God-given trait to say that I've always wanted to be a helper. And then to be able to match that with what I will call the skills that I've learned in my life. And that I've been really fortunate enough to be able to do this as a profession as well. and that's really what has driven me here.
Well, and I've always found, I've owned a few businesses in my life, and I've always found that when you stick with the vision and the mission, the business follows. It just kind of falls in place. So many people are so concerned with the business aspect that I feel sometimes they lose the vision or mission. And that plays into my next question, which would be, what's the significance of the recent Series B funding? What's that going to allow you to do with MedRhythms going forward?
So our recent Series B funding was in the amount of $25 million. And what that really allows us to do is to take our first product, which is in chronic stroke, and commercialize it. So as you can imagine, or maybe those that aren't familiar, in order to get a product to market in healthcare, it's a very complex and multifaceted strategy that needs to be in place in order to make that happen. From everything from the actual clinical data that you need, so running clinical results, running clinical trials. We also have to build a technology that works even prior to running clinical trials. So there's a lot of R&D, there's a lot of development that's required. There's robust evidence actually needed for the FDA, so multiple clinical trials that we need to run. And then you have to think about the commercial infrastructure to launch a product. And that in itself is a very long and expensive process. So the $25 million helps us to commercialize our first product in chronic stroke, which means literally get it through the FDA approval and into the hands of the patients that need it for the first time. We also have started to build a pipeline of additional products and other indications. So things like multiple sclerosis and Parkinson's disease and aging. The money will help us also to start to build early clinical evidence and early technological products in those different disease states as well. But the primary focus is really getting the product into the hands of the patients that need it for the first time.
Sounds like you're going to be busy for the next couple of years.
In the best way, Ralph. In the best way.
Where do you see your MedRhythms in 10 or 20 years?
I love thinking about this question because I think 10 to 20 year time frame, a lot can happen in 10 to 20 years. Especially in, as we call, startup land, where every week is 2 to 3 months in most people's lives, and how fast we move and how things are going. 10 to 20 years is basically another lifetime. But I think as we really think about that 10 to 20 year mark, that's when we really begin to see our vision realized. And our vision is a global vision of global impact across neurodisease and injury states, where this intervention, both music and neuroscience, digital therapeutics, become a standard of care. They're not an exception to the rule, but they are a part of everybody's standard of care when they have a neurologic disease and injury. And I think that 10 years from now, we will see a shift towards that, and that's when we start to see that true vision and the dream that we've had since the beginning realized.
And what do you like the most about your job? And then follow it up with, what do you like least about your job?
Let's think of the politically correct answers here, Brian. No. No, Ralph, I have what I think to be the best job in the world for a lot of reasons. And you've always heard people hear the phrase, when they ask you how you're doing, and I respond oftentimes with, I'm living the dream, right? And that's literally what I can say in a very literal state, that I'm living the dream that I've had for my life. And the reason why that is number one, the most rewarding part of my work is seeing the impact on patients, period. But number two, almost as exciting as that, is building a team that's really committed to that same mission. There is very little that's more rewarding of being able to provide for employees and their families and see them aligned around the same mission of making a big impact in the world. Also, don't get me wrong, it's really exciting to be able to interact with some of the world's leading neurologists and researchers, to see the clinical trials be successful, to build a technology that's never been done before. This is innovative and an exciting journey. What I like least is everything else. No, I'm kidding. Everything else that's not so fun. I would say the good and the bad about some of those other pieces. Thinking about FDA strategy, about reimbursement strategy, a lot of people may say that can't be fun, right? But as I look at that, those are necessary parts of the grander vision of how this gets into the hands of patients, that I actually find that thought process to be quite compelling. So is that as fun as watching a stroke survivor walk again? No. But it's still an important part of the pie to get us to that end vision.
Well, I think successful entrepreneurs have to basically feel that way. They have to, connect things that they don't necessarily aren't necessarily thrilled by back to the mission, and realize the importance of the bigger goal. And I'm sure that you still dream, because you've dreamed before in your life. What do you dream about doing now?
That's also a loaded question, Ralph. I think in this process, particularly of entrepreneurship and building an organization, the dreaming that we have now, I think that every day that we come into the office and we see progress and we hit these milestones, a new world of what's possible opens up to us as we think about moving into the future. And so my dreams now are thinking about, how do we use, what does the next level of the organization look like? When we go from our first commercial launch into all of these other disease states, what do those products look like? We just announced our recent partnership with Universal Music Group, which is the world's largest record label. And thinking about what could that partnership mean, not for MedRhythms, but for the patients that we serve. What could other partnerships like that, not just in the music space, but beyond the music space as well, mean for our patients? So I think my dreaming now is really pushing the envelope of what could this be for science, what could this be for business, and ultimately what could this be for the patients that we serve. Well, Ralph, have you ever been here before? Because if you come to Portland, all I say is bring all your bags, because you're never going to want to leave. Um, but as we think about why Maine, and we actually get asked that question a lot at MedRhythms, because it may not be the intuitive answer. We started the company in Boston and then chose to bring it back to Maine. I think at our core, both the co-founder Owen and I are both from Maine. And so with that, we care a lot about Maine and Maine's economy and Maine's people, wanting to be a part of that story. But also, there's some really exciting things happening here in the state of Maine, both from a cultural perspective, but also from an economic perspective. It's an up-and-coming city. There's a lot of life science and tech movement happening here, both in academia and in business. And we were actually stay very connected. Our ecosystem is largely Boston. We're only about an hour and a half from downtown Boston. And for all of our colleagues or folks that may see this that don't live on the East Coast, we are. It takes about the same amount of time for us to get to Boston as it takes to get from San Francisco to Silicon Valley. It's an hour and a half. A lot longer distance, but it's about an hour and a half. So what we get excited about is thinking about Portland, Maine, being the Silicon Valley of Boston. And I think that that's what we're starting to see shaped is what's happening here. It's just an exciting time to be here. Not to mention, Maine is beautiful, and you won't find better people in the world than Mainers. I said it, quote me, put it down on paper. So to dive in a bit more on how neurologic music therapy can be used for gait, I think it's important to provide some context here to begin with around the field of neurologic music therapy. So for those that may not be aware, I'm a board certified music therapist. So I have a master's degree in it, in music therapy, as well as a robust internship. So we think about this actually much like physical therapy, occupational therapy, or speech therapy, in that it's a credentialed health profession, except music is our medium. It's been around since about the mid-1950s or so as an established healthcare profession. And it's a very broad profession. So there are music therapists working in schools where kids have emotional or social needs, or learning needs, educational needs. There are music therapists working in end-of-life care, in palliative and hospice care. There are music therapists working in psychiatric institutes, working on emotion regulation and mental health needs. People working in pain management, in NICU settings. And then there's a specialization within music therapy called neurologic music therapy, which is what I've been trained and certified in. And I have advanced training in this field, which is looking purely at music through the lens of neuroscience, as I mentioned, on human perception and production of music, and how that can be clinically applied to patients with neurologic injury or disease. So as we focus in on gait, I set up earlier this sort of framing of global activation and neuroplasticity. So those are high-level principles. Then as we think about how it impacts walking, what we're really trying to leverage from a neuroscience perspective is this idea of entrainment. And entrainment is the auditory motor synchrony to an external rhythmic cue. And just to recap this as well, when your brain hears, as human beings, as we hear an external, consistent, and auditory rhythmic cue, like we hear in music, activates our auditory system because it's an auditory cue that we hear. But our auditory system and our motor system, so the parts of your brain that are responsible for movement, are robustly connected at a subconscious level, such that you can use an external auditory cue to literally engage the motor system. So what happens is, as we listen to music, our motor system is firing. Now that's applicable in healthy individuals, neurologically healthy individuals. But it's also applicable to those who have damage to the motor system. So stroke, Parkinson's disease, traumatic brain injury, multiple sclerosis. We can use the external auditory or rhythmic cue to engage the motor system, to help it to fire more frequently and consistently. What entrainment looks like in clinical practice is our patient's ability to walk to the beat of the music. So that's from a neuroscience perspective. From a clinical perspective, since about the early, and I'll actually say on the neuroscience side, it was early studies in the mid-1970s were the first time that it was shown that you could use an external auditory cue to engage the motor system. It wasn't until about 20 years later, in the mid-1990s, that there started to be clinical research showing how auditory motor entrainment could improve outcomes. So auditory motor entrainment was used as the foundation of this standardized clinical intervention called rhythmic auditory stimulation. It's been shown in this research of rhythmic auditory stimulation, we'll call it RAS for short, that RAS can improve things like speed, variability, cadence, stride length, symmetry of left to right steps, and actually to reduce falls in Parkinson's disease. So very robust research across disease states showing that the clinical impact of rhythmic auditory stimulation is profound. Yeah, Well, it's important to point out that when we think about recovery, whether this is from stroke, brain injury, Parkinson's, etc., everybody is different in their trajectory and what's sort of what we would expect to see from an outcomes perspective. I'm sure many of you have heard this before. There's no two brain injuries that are the same, no two strokes that are the same. So everybody presents slightly differently and has a different trajectory in their recovery. What's really exciting about this is that it was once thought that once you reach that 6 to 12 months post-injury, that's where you were going to plateau and that you were never going to improve after that point. What we now know from the research is that that is fundamentally not true. And we know that from the research both in neuroplasticity, but also in the research around our products, that is fundamentally not true. That there is no point in life at which neuroplasticity stops. So it certainly slows as we age, but there's no point at which neuroplasticity stops. So we can always expect to leverage that in the outcomes. So we do see very good responses from a vast, what I'll say, spectrum of different functioning levels and disease states. However, everybody's journey through this is different. It doesn't work for everyone. That's the nature of brains as well, and then that's the nature of neuroscience. Is unfortunately, there's no magic pill. But we do see a very good response across the boards of functioning levels in populations. And I think the bright part of this is even for those patients that maybe don't see the response that they may expect, it's a fun intervention that also has very little side effects, right? So there's the risk profile here is much different than drugs or maybe some other interventions as well.
It's my understanding that plateauing occurs when you no longer challenge the brain, and that mixing it up and keeping the brain engaged and challenged is important. I'm a big believer in neuroplasticity. I've actually videotaped myself doing some things at 11 years out to visually show it to people. So I think you're onto something there, and challenging the brain is, from what I understand, is the key to the brain continuing to learn.
Yes, and if I may just comment on that, Ralph. Sure. Our brains are formed through experience. So as we think about how we grow, and I mean even through evolution, but how we grow as individuals from birth to death, our brains are shaped by the experiences that we have in life. And we can call that, those experiences, these are sensory inputs. So things that we feel, things that we see, things that we hear, things that we smell, that we taste, that we touch, right? So everything that we do on a day-to-day basis shapes our lives. As we grow and as we age, those experiences, sometimes we don't experience new stimuli. So if we're not exercising to music, or if we're not, seeing new visuals, right? That can be something that I wouldn't say stops neuroplasticity, but there's nothing that's challenging those new connections in the brain. So what's interesting about the music experience is that we're providing a new stimuli to the brain to help with the outcomes, but they've also shown that independent of the fact that music is a new stimulation, there's something about music itself that aids in neuroplasticity that's not just because we're doing something new and not just because we're leveraging frequency and consistency, right? So that's the other thing about neuroplasticity, is that in order to see a neuroplastic change, there must be frequency and consistency, meaning you need to do things over and over again to get them to stick. Your brain's like any other muscle. You don't go to the gym once and get giant biceps, right? If we did, everybody would do that, right? It's not easy. Your brain is just like that. You need to go to the gym, so to speak, with your brain often and have new experiences. But there is something about music, independent of the frequency and consistency, that leverages neuroplasticity, that aids in that process more than other stimuli, which is why it becomes such a compelling healthcare stimulus.
This is interesting and a subject that I'm extremely interested in because, like you, with the whole thing about how does this work and how do we bring it to a lot of people, that interests me. How do we maximize neuroplasticity? One of the things that I have a Tuesday Zoom meeting, as you know, and one of the things that we've been talking about is the subject. And recently I've met a number of interesting folks. One's a neuroscientist who had a stroke, and another one is a friend of mine who had a stroke and then trained to become an occupational therapist. And we've been talking around the concepts of maximizing neuroplasticity and also how your brain builds a blueprint. You were alluding to this a little bit about the variety of inputs, visual and whatever, and the mixing it up. There's very specific ways that our brains learn, and one of the things that I want to bring to stroke recovery is this idea of, like you're doing with music therapy and MedRhythms. How can you leverage these things in your own recovery to maximize the science? Basically, that's what we're talking about here.
Right. I mean, what's amazing is, particularly as you look at neuroscience, there's so much that we know about the human brain. But I would say there's also a giant gap in what we know versus what's actually applied in healthcare. And meaning that we're not leveraging the science to its best potential. I mean, that's one of the reasons why MedRhythms exists. There's science that supports this works. There's data that supports this works. It's not being implemented. Not to say that that's fundamentally any person or part of the ecosystem's fault. It's a complex ecosystem to change healthcare over time. But there's gaps in what we call translational sort of research or even translational applications of the research. But in addition to that, there's what gets me very excited is there's also so much that we don't know about the brain and neuroscience. Fundamentally, we don't really know why some people have recoveries from brain injuries that take them back to the way that they were at baseline, and some people don't. That's not incredibly clear to the field of medicine and neuroscience. So we still have a long ways to go and a lot to learn, which is also very an exciting place to be.
Well, and this is, that gap that you're identifying between the way what science knows and what's delivered. That's something that I'm very interested in. I have this goal of trying to fundamentally change stroke recovery in some way. And of course, as I move further and further along, that gets more clearly defined. But one of the things would be to, create a sort of a servo, a feedback loop, to where we take some of the science and try and feed it back into the healthcare system to, I guess you would say, to create more and better outcomes for patients. I've been to a lot of physical therapy, and I've been to neuro-trained physical therapists, and they definitely have a different take on it. But typically, a lot of the science that's available to us is not being implemented. And of course, we have to realize that science didn't actually believe in neuroplasticity as little as 40 years ago. So, this is an aircraft carrier, if you will, that, they're real hard to steer, hard to change course. Takes a while to turn around an aircraft carrier, and I think that'll be true with our healthcare system.
Well, there's actually a statistic that, and I learned this actually, it was at the American Congress of Rehabilitation Medicine a few years ago, that there's a statistic in healthcare that from the time that something is discovered that it works until it begins to be implemented, so not globally implemented, but until it begins to be implemented, on average is 17 years. So if we let that one sink in for a moment, from the time we say, hey, this works, until it begins to be implemented, on average is 17 years. So that's sort of the initial battle, so to speak, that we as healthcare innovators are battling, and there's a lot of factors, as we mentioned, that come into play when you think about that timeline. Humans are resistant to change by nature, so that's a challenge in and of itself. Let alone some of the the hills that are in place from getting new. Because when we think about widespread adoption of anything, there has to be payment, right? So there has to be reimbursement. It takes a long time to get things to get reimbursed. I do think what I get excited about, though, is that the advancements of technology and the ability to collect massive amounts of data quickly, I think will help move the needle and maybe shorten that timeline from 17 to maybe 5, perhaps. But this is when we think about the institution that is healthcare, and you've got providers being the doctors, you've got patients. Because let's not forget that if we have new interventions that are going to work, patients actually have to do them, right? So when we think about if we want to get a successful digital therapeutic that improves walking into the market, part of our success in being able to get reimbursement, to be able to get doctors to prescribe these, patients actually have to do it, right? And that behavior also needs to change in this ecosystem, right? But it's really a full conglomeration of all of these different pieces moving at the same time for us to really see a significant impact to the healthcare ecosystem at large.
Well, and that's a lot of what I'm trying to do, is to get people to be more forward thinking and accepting of things, research particularly. I try to encourage stroke survivors in my Facebook groups to participate in research, because I feel very strongly that if we want to see change, we need to be part of that change. And so I could help with the last part. And the other thing that you said was 17 years. I'm going to have got my work cut out for me. Maybe we can cut that down, because I'll be 88 years old in 17 years.
Yeah, my goal, Ralph, is that the trajectory for this from here on out is much faster than 17 years, and that's what we can hope for. But it's gonna take all of us to make it happen.
How does your product affect brain patterning, and how does that relate, in your opinion, to or scientifically to what you call the carryover effect? Sure.
Like neuroplasticity, like
I found that by using neuroplasticity, you can ultimately train your brain to do something different than the way you were doing it, by typically by lots of repetitions, spending time in spending time with whatever you're trying to work on. And by patterning, I mean that it have a lasting effect. You could do something like one time and discover it, but that just like you said, that with the 17 years, the fact that I discover something, like if I hold on to a walker and I pattern myself, then I can let go of the walker and do a number of them, and when it breaks down, I can light touch the walker again, and eventually I get to where I don't have to go through the process. I've, in a sense, patterned my brain, and I have the carryover effect. Does that make it clear?
Yeah, perfectly clear. And it's an important question to ask, I think, as we think about new treatments, as we think about our value that we could provide, because we're really focused on that carryover. And for those listening, what we mean by carryover is, do we see a change in somebody's function, so in our case walking, after the treatment, even when the music is not present? So we call that a sort of a more permanent change. So can we do an intervention that leads to a permanent change? And what's really interesting about that is that's an important question to ask, because I've always fundamentally believed that Well, if I have to follow somebody around with a guitar all the time, or if they have to, constantly be listening to music, is there a value in the intervention? But what we know from the research is that we do see carryover effects. Because what's actually happening is, by virtue of the stimulation of the brain, particularly the areas that are responsible for movement, with music, we are creating new pathways, or depending upon the injury, to make this, I think, a little bit more broad, depending on the injury, we are creating new pathways or strengthening old pathways. And what that literally means, when we talk about strengthening old pathways, we literally mean that there's parts of the brain that the connections exist that didn't exist pre the training, or anatomically are literally thicker by virtue of doing the intervention than if you didn't do the intervention. So we're talking about structural changes to the brain. When you have structural changes to the brain, that's when you can have carryover functions. That's when you can have lasting effects that are not there, or that are there when the intervention is not. So for our chronic stroke product, we are using music, but there's also a frequency and consistency. So 3 times per week for at least a month to do this intervention, and it might be months at a time, in order to see that carryover. But what we're literally doing is changing neural pathways for that to persist. I'm going to say another call here out because I do think this is really important. So we spend a lot of time trying to change people's perspectives, from doctors' perspectives and researchers' perspectives, payers' perspectives, about how to think about these new interventions and these new therapies, right? But fundamentally, the only way they work, the only way we see neuroplastic change, the only way we see functional carryover is if patients use them. They have to be committed to doing it. They have to be committed to doing it over time. But here's an interesting thing about walking. If you have a functional change in your walking through the intervention, and then you stop walking, you will lose those gains that you made from the intervention. So what we're actually also doing is changing lifestyle over time. Because once somebody improves the way that they walk, they need to continue to walk. So think about this analogy again for going to the gym. If you go to the gym 5 days a week for 6 months and you see fundamental changes in your muscle capacity or your strength, and then you sit on your couch for the next 6 months, you'll lose what you gained. So this is about engaging in the therapy, but then also changing a lifestyle to maintain those habits once you've finished the therapy as well.
Yeah, I think of it kind of like we just did a meeting on dieting, and dieting doesn't work because it's kind of a temporary thinking. If you go on to something, you think you're going to come off of it. So typically the people that lose weight change their lifestyle, and that's what you're talking about. I've also found that very much found that if you don't do I'm 13 years out. I don't necessarily work on specific things anymore, but I make sure that I do a certain level of maintenance, and that can actually come from living. Therapies all around you, yard work and whatever, but I also will do specific exercises. I'll let you comment on that in a minute. There's one more thing I wanted to make you aware of that I found a couple of times where I was disconnected from, you mentioned something about existing pathways. Well, one time I was, Chuck and I were shooting a video, and it was on dealing cards as a good occupational therapy for your hands. And all of a sudden, I hadn't dealt cards since before my stroke. And it was kind of awkward at first. And then all of a sudden, I always pushed him off with the left and dealt him with the right because I was right-handed. And I switched and said, of course, you should do it bilaterally and do it both ways. Make your left hand put the cards out and everything. When I switched over to my right, I could hardly push the cards out because I had no experience. But when I went back to the left, it's almost as if I felt like my brain, all of a sudden, like I could do it like I had no stroke. It's almost as if, and I think I've seen this a couple times in myself and in other people, where somehow I established some pathways back to something that existed in my brain before and after the stroke, but got disconnected.
Well, it's interesting because a lot of people refer to that, people say muscle memory, right? So, thinking about these tasks that you haven't done for a long time, and even you may have had an event, maybe a stroke, that may interfere, but then you go back and it automatically comes back. Well, really what you've done throughout your life, particularly those types of small, rapid movements, that if you played cards, you probably did often, I mean, you've created neural pathways for those movements, right? That became part of how your body operated. And when you talk about automaticity, I would almost guarantee that you could probably right now sit there and have a conversation with me and deal cards at the same time, because you've done it so often that it's become a subconscious task. You wouldn't have to sit there and think, move my thumb, grab the card, lay it down. You would just do it while we're having a conversation, because you've created so many pathways in your brain to allow that to become subconscious. I actually think about this, it's interesting, like I think about this as it relates to, I'm a drummer by training, which I mentioned. When I was learning to play the drum kit, the how I would do this is I would, as you can think of, when you play a drum kit, you use both feet and you use both hands simultaneously. So when I was learning to play, I would start with my right foot, and I would play the pattern of a drum beat with my right foot. And I would play that over and over and over again until I could do it while talking. So if I could do it while talking, then I would add a hand. And then I would add my hand and my foot at the same time. And then I would play this until I could do it while I was having a conversation. That's when I knew it had become subconscious. And then I'd add a different hand. And then I'd add my other foot. To the point that we got to a point where when I knew I was proficient at the actual entire beat, call it, was when I could play both hands, both feet, and have a conversation while doing it at the same time. When you remove that and you go 5 years without playing, you could go back and sit down at a drum kit, and that's probably going to come right back, because it's so ingrained at a subconscious level that you don't have to think about it, so that you could just sit down and play it. And it's similar with these types of sort of automatic movements, as you've driven that subconsciously and into you've driven it to automaticity, such that, e.g. muscle memory, when you start to do it again, it just comes back. But it's likely a neural connection, not a memory connection.
Right. Yeah, I'm not qualified to, but I agree with you. I've also, I had a neuro-trained physical therapist, and we were working on my gait, and one of the things that she had me do was, she said, do name the state capitals while you're walking. I ended up doing, I can do math in my head, so I was multiplying 3-digit numbers by 2-digit numbers in my head while I'm walking. The idea of challenging the brain and building stuff up. I guess maybe the idea was if you give another task like the mathematics or something, well, and you're doing your walking, it's sort of like my MedRhythms experience. The music caused me to go into a more automatic mode with, like say when I was doing math, I had to be in a more automatic mode with my walking in order to have the brain power to do that. It's kind of challenging at first, but eventually I kind of got to it, and I think that the theory would be that then when you remove the math, you've made your walking more automatic, which is what it was like pre-stroke. People walking around they don't realize that they don't think about anything. One time I watched these two waitresses at a restaurant I was eating out on, watching the sun go down on the deck. And they came walking down the steps. They had these little cocktail trays with about 8 drinks on them each. And they were talking to each other, and I said, what are they going to do when they hit the steps? There's like 8 steps. They didn't even look down. They kept talking to each other, carrying these trays, went boom, 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 right down the steps, and I went, oh my God, you don't know how lucky you are to have that level of brain processing power. So, yeah, I think it's a real struggle for stroke survivors to try and go from the how did I used to move? Oh, now I'm overthinking it, back to the more natural ways. At least it seems that way to it's has seemed that way to me in my own recovery and some of the ones that I've observed.
Well, I mean, 2 points there, Ralph, is that evolutionarily, right, as human beings, we are made biologically to walk with 2 feet. And we are made as bipedal beings to what we call ambulate like that. 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. That, even when we think about evolution, that has to be automatic for humans to survive in the world, because you have to be able to move and hunt and do all of these things while you're walking. So we are actually naturally made to walk automatically. So when an event happens in our brain, traumatic brain injury, stroke, whatever it might be, that interferes with that automaticity. Oftentimes what it feels like is that, and I see this in our patients all the time, is they stand up from a wheelchair, they try to walk again, and they think, I gotta move that right foot. And then I gotta hip hike my left leg, push it forward, step it down. So it's not even just thinking about walking, it's micro tasks of walking in real time, right? So hip hike, pick up that foot, push it forward, set it down. And what we would do in the hospital is I would, we think back about RAS 1.0, which was me with a guitar walking backwards. I would oftentimes tell my patients, I want you to relax, look at me, and don't think about walking. Just move. And what we're trying to do is to get rid of that cognitive interference, right? So when you think about walking too much, when you think about those tasks, which, don't get me wrong, in early days post-injury, there's intention that's required to get that to move. But there is going to hit a point where your intention, or your cognitive intention, becomes cognitive interference, where you're actually disrupting the automaticity of movement and not allowing that to happen. And so it's really trying to get that transition. And so by using an external stimuli like music, that's really what we're trying to do, is to get rid of the cognitive interference to allow this subconscious process to happen that we as humans are made to do. The other point I wanted to make, Ralph, about your point around this maintenance, right? So thinking about walking and doing things and your maintenance is just sort of how you live your life. And that's the really important point, and I think the big need as it relates to improving walking. So there's actually data that shows that there's a walking speed marker that allows people to be community ambulators. So lots of data has been shown that if you walk below 0.8 meters per second, and not really, I'm not saying this so that you understand what the numbers mean, but there's a level of your speed of walking that if you walk below, you're considered a limited community ambulator, meaning you can't really cross the street without the lights turning from red to green. Ambulation just in the community is more difficult. Ambulation around your house is difficult. A lot of that is correlated to speed. And if you can improve your walking speed to a point that you can walk faster than that, it actually changes your independence level, meaning you can walk more freely in your environment. You can do so more safely. So there's this sort of interesting circle that happens where, yes, we can drive neuroplasticity and we can drive functioning levels to improve. And by virtue of improving, you can change your life more. So you don't have to actually think about, well, now that the intervention's not here, I need to keep walking 3 times per week. Well, no. Hopefully, now that you've changed your functioning level, improved the way that you walk, you're more independent in your community. And so your maintenance is actually just being independent. It's actually just walking more, which helps to sustain those impacts. But it's a really interesting, specific to walking, that's a really interesting sort of part of this, is that not only are we changing function, but we're hoping to change independence level as well, to allow people to be more independent in their lives.
Well, yeah, and I'm calling it overthinking, and you're calling it cognitive interference. I think we're talking about the same thing, that conscious mind trying to dictate walking, which is something, as you said, we were built to walk. It's interesting because when you started counting out 1, 2, 1, 2, my left foot wanted to hit the floor on the two.
Yes. Yeah.
I just went, right back into that mode. And I think that this is part of the key to stroke recovery, to getting back, or any brain recovery, is getting back to automatic mode. And it's just unbelievably hard to stop that whole cognitive interference process. You have to somehow put yourself into what I call zones, safe zone, if you want to get rid of fear. You're talking about a music zone where your brain shifts gears and is receptive, and there's a connection between the music and the motor skills. And so it's fascinating, because I think there's, one of the things I like about this subject and what I'm trying to do is, and I'm sure you feel the same way, there's an infinite amount to learn out there, and that's I don't find that discouraging. I actually find that encouraging. I think, well, isn't that wonderful that I'm actually involved in something that has no end, as opposed to getting frustrated that you could never learn all of it. And one more thing, I'll let you comment, was early on, the whole thing I heard about speed, I went, ooh, because speed oftentimes, well, I guess I kind of equated, because some people try and work on speed. And I don't think that they should do that. I try and preach that speed follows form. You work on your form. And what I experienced with the MedRhythms product was a disruption of that. Well, I shouldn't use that twice. It was able to allow me not to impose my cognitive disruption on the whole situation, and get back a little bit more to that automatic way. And to me, that's as stroke survivors or brain injury survivors, that's one of the things that we're striving to do, get rid of that cognitive interference.
Yeah, and it's a good point, Ralph, because when we talk about improving speed, it's improving speed, but not at the cost of quality. Because yes, in going and walking faster, just taking faster steps, if you're not safe to do so, is not good. But that's why, when we think about these clinical interventions, you have to consider both. So we want to improve speed of stroke survivors, but we need to make sure that they're also improving their stride length and that they're improving their symmetry along with it. And the research in RAS shows that when you walk to rhythm, those things can improve. They can improve the symmetry. It can improve the stride length, so that you're improving the speed overall, but in a high quality way, to ensure that we're best suited for that I don't want to call it reintegration, but the taking part in our lives in whatever way that is meaningful for us.
What kinds of things do you like to do when you're not at work?
As you can imagine, music is an important part of my life. I still like to play music, particularly with my almost 2-year-old son now, and getting him engaged in life and in music is a lot of fun. And outside of that, I will say that I love my work, and it is my life, and so I do enjoy the work that I do, but I enjoy reading new things about neuroscience. I enjoy reading new books. I try to always have an active book reading that I'm doing, and playing music, and then being with my family and friends also fuels me, and so being social in that way is a big part of my life.
Here's the answer to your question about when did my baby become a little boy or a little man, and that would be when he started walking and stood up, and when he stood up and started walking, and when he started talking. There,
You got that right.
he's a beautiful child, and it'll be interesting to see what impact music has on his life, won't it?
So I think we're getting there slowly.
Well, I have an interesting idea for you. Sometimes I have a couple things in my mind at the same time, and all of a sudden I connect the dots. And one of them recently was I was promoting a survey on dance, using dance as a therapeutic method for stroke recovery for the Medical University of South Carolina's Stroke Recovery Research Center, and I run a Facebook group for them. So one of the things I do is, like, as the admin, I post it and I can pin it to the top, and I made a graphic for them and everything. Anyway, all of a sudden I thought, I guess I had you on my brain along with this dance thing, and I thought, wow, I wonder if it would be interesting to see about this dance therapy, how that works, and how could you somehow connect the dots between music and dance. So that's that's something I'm looking out for. I've always, like you, I'm sure you're the same way, I've always got about 15 or 20 things in my mind that I'm like, I've thought about, and like maybe there's a connection, so like they get on my, oh, I hate to use it, but let's use it, radar screen. So whenever they come up, I go, okay, file that away with that. So,
well, I do have some colleagues, actually, Ralph, that you may be interested in talking to, who are focused on dance therapy for neurologic disease and injury. And there is a lot of similarities, as you can imagine, around the neural mechanisms that are helpful in both. But dance is not my area. But if you ever want to have a conversation, I know some people that may be helpful, Ralph.
well, maybe what I'll do is get that information and pass it back to this graduate student and her professors at the, have done some volunteer work at this Medical University of South Carolina. Has, as far as I know, the only stroke recovery research center. They're doing triple blind studies on various therapies to see what's the most effective. They got about, I think it was a $25 million grant from NIH, and they've built a building and a facility. Everything's hooked to computers. Like you, they're collecting a lot of data. I'm, of course, trying to get more involved with them. In fact, I'd love to at some point. I have got this vision that we could, I'm forming a nonprofit. This is off, a little bit off, but forming a nonprofit, and one of the things we thought about doing is getting funding to do studies and partnering with somebody like you to implement the research, and then taking it to the Stroke Recovery Research Center and having them do the triple blind studies to validate what we're doing. But that's not going to be happening this week. I'm still got to file the papers with the IRS and everything. But, it's just like, the work that you're doing and the work that I'm doing, I see it pretty much like recovery. Just get up every morning and push the rock uphill.
That's right. That's right. The phrase that we use is, that I use is, you just got to keep pushing on the elephant, and eventually it will move.
That's interesting.
And it is a journey of, I can see that in you as well, Ralph, is folks that are, action focused. So you think about things, but you also do things, right? You're taking action to actually change the situation, to help people's lives, and with a commitment to excellence as well. And when you do that day after day after day, and then you find like-minded individuals that are doing the same things, this is going to take a wave, right? Nothing moves, particularly in healthcare, in isolation or in silos, and it's going to take all of us to sort of move together in order to really to make a big splash. But it is the daily grind that really moves the needle. Well, thanks, Ralph, for having me here. It's an honor, and anytime we get to tell the story about the journey that we're on at MedRhythms, it's always an honor for me. It's an honor to be doing this work, and an honor to be here with you. As I mentioned, somebody who has provided so much value to the stroke survivor community, and I appreciate the work that you do and your commitment to that every single day. So thanks for having me, and look forward to continuing our conversation sometime.
Well, I'd love to continue it sometime, and I appreciate you taking the time out of your busy schedule. And I just keep at what I'm doing, like you keep at what you're doing, and eventually you get somewhere. eventually you move the elephant.
That's right.
We'll just keep moving the elephant, and I look forward to talking to you again sometime in the near future.
Great. All right. Thank you, Ralph.
Thank you.